His Excellency, President of the Republic of Finland, Mr. Sauli Niinistö, distinguished Minister Honorary Ambassador Jaakko Iloniemi and his family members, honored speakers Mr. Bildt and Dr. Björn Wahlroos, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure to warmly welcome you to this lecture event at the occasion of Minister Ambassador Jaakko Iloniemi's 90th anniversary. This event is organized by Atlantic Council of Finland, the Finnish Business and Policy Forum EVA, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland. The chair of the Board of Atlantic Council of Finland, Minister Honorary Liisa Jaakonsaari, regrets she cannot be here and conveys her congratulations to Minister Iloniemi. At the very end of the lecture event, we shall hear a brief intervention by Mr. Carl Haglund of EVA. This afternoon, one of the aims of this afternoon is to explore themes related to foreign and security policy, transatlantic relations, Finnish-Swedish relationship, as well as Finland's and Sweden's potential future NATO membership. Since the idea of this event evolved and developed since last summer, our security landscape has been radically changed. The Russian attack of aggression to Ukraine, with its utmost brutal humanitarian and human rights consequences, is the reality in which Finland has submitted her NATO membership application together tillsammans with Sweden. In this changed environment, we have much to reflect upon. The extraordinary career of Minister Iloniemi gives us a very helpful perspective. His unique diplomatic experience includes, inter alia, post of ambassador to the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and that of ambassador of Finland to the United States. In addition, as the head of the Finnish Business and Policy Forum after his diplomatic career, minister and the first chairman and the founding father of the Atlantic Council of Finland, Minister Iloniemi has successfully influenced the Finnish business environment, public opinion, and thinking with his both broad and in-depth expertise. With this welcome and brief introduction, it is my pleasure to welcome the President of the Republic, Mr. Sauli Niinistö, for the opening words.
Your Excellency, Minister Jaakko Iloniemi, ladies and gentlemen. I want to open by extending my warmest congratulations to Minister Jaakko Iloniemi on his 90th birthday. In the field of Finnish foreign policy, Jaakko Iloniemi is a constant. For decades, he has shaped policy and discussion. First as a diplomat in some of the key moments of our political history, later as an ardent observer and commentator. The red thread has remained increasing Finland's room to maneuver. Jaakko is one of the sharpest and most far-sighted analysts in the field. He has unique perspective and experience. In today's fast-paced world, where politics is sometimes conducted tweet by tweet, I greatly appreciate our connection. Throughout my presidency, we have had valuable discussions and held a regular correspondence. In conversations, you, Jaakko, have a very special reassuring ability, even when very serious matters or threats are discussed, the listener often finds himself afterwards feeling surprisingly calm and confident. There may be many examples of his foresight. The recent biography, Eminence, tells the story of a meeting between a young Senator John Biden and Ambassador Iloniemi about 40 years ago. After the meeting, Iloniemi reported the bright senator might have ambitions for the White House. Many sharp observations are also to be found in our correspondence. On September 14th, 2015, you wrote me a letter titled "Finland and Sweden Hand in Hand, Till How Far?" Jaakko's personal history is closely intertwined with Finland's post-war policy history. He entered the States already in the 1950s as Secretary General of the Student Union, SUL. In the 60s, he was instrumental in creating Finland's development aid policies. In the 70s, he became known as the driving force behind the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. The 1975 CSCE is a milestone in the Finnish political history. The organization of the conference took years of preparation and skillful diplomacy. As a result, the Helsinki Final Act established a set of principles that became a foundation for the European security order for almost 50 years. Now, Russia's brutal war in Ukraine and demands to NATO have called those principles into question. Again, we need skillful diplomacy. It is of immense value that Jaakko still continues to share his wisdom and experience with the diplomats battling with today's challenges. Over the years, Jaakko has consistently advocated for Finland's active participation in the Western community and strengthening of transatlantic cooperation. He has forged links between Finland and the US as an ambassador to Washington and as the first chairman of the Atlantic Council. In the 1990s, as the CEO of EVA, Finnish Business and Policy Forum, he was a strong voice for Finland's EU accession. We cemented the direction of our foreign policy by joining the EU in 1995. Now, in a new situation, we are taking the logical next step. We are claiming our sovereign right stated in the Helsinki Final Act to seek membership in NATO. Democracy needs rich debate and the sharing of expertise. With incredible energy, Jaakko has served the people and decision makers alike by actively participating in the public conversation. He is known as a tactful, logical, and facts-based debater. In 1962, he wrote, "It's a matter for the foreign policy leadership to find the way of taking our position to practice, but only enlightened voters can give the direction for our actions in international issues." That's what they, people, did this spring. I fully share the assessment and thank Jaakko for the countless articles, columns and remarks he has published over the years. Once more, congratulations, and let our conversation continue.
Thank you, Mr. President, for your wise and thoughtful opening words on the occasion of the 90th birthday of Mr. Iloniemi. I think we cannot but agree that Minister Iloniemi is the grand old man of Finnish foreign policy. As stipulated in his recently published biography, a true expert with a gentle style, fortiter in re, suaviter in modo. As a next step in our program, I'm very pleased to invite our estimated guest lecturer, Mr. Carl Bildt, co-chair of European Council on Foreign Relations, former Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Sweden, to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Minister, Ambassador, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed more than an honor to be asked to deliver the first Jaakko Iloniemi lecture, and to do so in the presence of both the President of the Republic and of Jaakko Iloniemi himself. But before doing that, let me just express my personal thanks to you, because I remember during the decades coming to Helsinki as what was in those days a young man. You were always willing to share your wisdom with a visitor from the other side of the Baltic Sea, and I belong to those that have benefited tremendously from that over the years. Thank you. To say that we are living in interesting times is certainly no exaggeration. Historians will look back at these days of ours as a watershed in the history of our countries and of our continent. As we gather here, war is raging on the plains of the east of Europe. Millions of people have been forced to flee. Cities are being reduced to rubble by constant bombardment. The industrial infrastructure of a major European country is systematically destroyed. 3 months into the war, tens of thousands of soldiers have already lost their lives. Our Europe, our world is changing. Some of you might still remember the famous phrase of the first European Union security strategy less than 2 decades ago, which proudly stated, and I quote, "Europe has never been so prosperous, so secure, nor so free." And the violence of the first half of the 20th century has given way to a period of peace and stability unprecedented in European history, end of quote. There was, of course, an amount of hyperbole in this. We had just come out of a decade of fairly brutal wars of disintegration in the Balkans, but still, it caught the mood of those years. The dissolution of the Soviet Union, slightly more than a decade earlier, had ushered into an era of global cooperation and democratic advance, and nowhere was this more evident than in our part of the world. Finland and Sweden, as the President just alluded to, had joined the European Union together in 1995, thus ending a long, different period of slightly different sorts of neutrality, and the 3 former Soviet republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were on the final run towards membership of both the EU and NATO. The same warm midsummer day in 1995, when Esko Aho for Finland and me for Sweden signed our country's treaties of accession to the EU, the Russian President Boris Yeltsin was also present on Corfu and signed the ambitious partnership and cooperation agreement between Russia and the EU. But things clearly didn't turn out as we had all hoped for. The wheels of history continued to turn and did so in directions we had hoped could be avoided. I think it was during a couple of months in 2008 that the long summer of hope finally came to an end, and we entered a period of new turmoil and tension. The short war in August between Russia and Georgia was a complex affair. But suddenly, we saw not only that the threshold for Russia to use military power was lower than many of us had thought, but also, and perhaps even more ominously, that the respect for the established borders that had been proclaimed fundamental to the security of our continent was totally disregarded. For most of the time, this was still seen as perhaps just a blip. Soon the new US administration announced a reset of relations with Russia, and the EU, for its part, launched a partnership for modernization with Moscow. Some years later, in 2013, the very last American tank was withdrawn from the continent of Europe. As the clouds gathered again over the east of Europe in the autumn of 2013, the attention of the world was focused on the tragedy of Syria. But now Russia set itself on preventing Ukraine from entering into a relationship with the European Union that in fact wasn't too different from what Russia itself had aspired to some years earlier. But things have changed. Now, the ambition of Vladimir Putin was to set up a new Eurasian Union as a new center of power and influence on the continent, with Russia obviously in the driving seat, and Ukraine was fundamental to that project. He had already misjudged Ukraine when he tried to interfere in its politics in connection with the Orange Revolution in 2004. And now he gravely misjudged the country again. It was not for turning. But step by step he escalated his pressure on the economy, on the country, until its regime collapsed, and he decided to take the step of going to war to dismember Ukraine. On March 1st of 2014, in a most extraordinary step, he asked for and got the authorization of the Federation Council of the Russian Federation to use the Russian armed forces on the entire territory of Ukraine. By that time, of course, the operation to take over Crimea was already well underway, and the subsequent operation to try to carve out the eastern and southern parts of the country was under active preparation. Apart from taking over Crimea, again violating the borders of Europe, and getting control of parts of the Donbas region, his policies failed again. Ukraine consolidated its democracy, it proceeded with agreement with the European Union, and based on what it had experienced, it replaced its constitutional provision for neutrality with one about seeking membership of the EU and of NATO. It was a massive strategic failure for the Kremlin. The westward development of Ukraine, hardly perfect, but certainly determined, continued or even accelerated. And this set the course for what we see today. In the Kremlin rhetoric leading up to this war, there was a lot of talk about the eastern expansion of NATO as the core of the conflict, disregarding both that the last such expansion happened nearly 2 decades ago, that there had been virtually no new NATO facility or whatever in terms of forces in these countries prior to 2014, and that an imminent membership of NATO for Ukraine was certainly not in the card. But it wasn't NATO going east that was the core Kremlin concern. It was Ukraine going west. And of course it did so as a function of its democratic political system. In his different speeches, Vladimir Putin has made it clear that it was this that he deemed utterly unacceptable. with its democratic development, and with its urge to cooperate and integrate with the rest of Europe, Ukraine risked turning into what Vladimir Putin called an anti-Russia. And this he could not accept. He had to act. He could not wait. The threat was growing by the day. That's more or less his own words. When the EU, in March of this year, after rather extensive debate, issued what they call its strategic compass, it opened in a very different way from the document nearly 2 decades ago that I cited earlier, and is worth quoting at some length. The return of war in Europe, with Russia's unjustified and unprovoked aggression against Ukraine, as well as major geopolitical shifts, are challenging our ability to promote our vision and defend our interests. We live in an era of strategic competition and complex security threats. We see conflicts, military buildups and aggressions, and sources of instability increasing in our neighborhood and beyond. This is a message that is fairly stark, agreed by all of the 27 member countries. It has, of course, major consequences for the EU and for relations across the Atlantic and for our Nordic countries. The crimes committed by Russia are therefore to see. When after the Second World War, the International War Crimes Tribunals met in Nuremberg and Tokyo, they made it clear that the crime of aggression was what they called the supreme international crime. And it was for this crime that the senior leaders of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan were sentenced. And it has remained the supreme crime under international law since then. Violating the borders and territorial integrity of states is a fundamental violation, not least of the Helsinki Accords. This was done by Russia in 2008 in Georgia, in 2014 in Ukraine, and now has been done by Russia again, with the decision again to dismember Ukraine. We should remember that both when the Soviet Union was dissolved, and when the same happened with Yugoslavia, respect for the established borders or boundaries between the different constituent republics was seen as fundamental to preserve stability and peace. It's obviously too early to predict the outcome of the military confrontation in the east of Europe. The first 3 months have clearly not gone as the Kremlin had expected. The political and the military battle for Kiev was lost, and the immediate military aim now seems to be to consolidate and gradually expand control of parts of Ukraine territory in the south and in the east. As we speak, the strong belief in Kiev is that they can win, and the strong conviction in the Kremlin is that it must not lose. We are in all probability heading for a lengthy war of attrition. Days of diplomacy look distinctly distant. The ultimate aim of war, beyond the immediate military, is, as von Clausewitz taught us, to break the political will of the opponent. And the question is, of course, will it break first in Moscow, or in Kiev, or in Washington, or in Brussels, or the capitals of Europe? That we don't know. What we do know is that the burden of war will build up. War is an exceedingly costly affair. But I think it's reasonable to assume that as long as the political will holds up in Kiev, it will hold up in Washington, and then also in Brussels, EU, and the capitals of Europe. And the critical question is whether this will be enough to ultimately break the political will in Moscow. I think it would be unwise to underestimate the stamina of Russia. His army has certainly underperformed. Its economy will face hard times for years to come. It has effectively cut itself off from all of the West. But as long as its regime survives, the war will, in the one form or the other, go on. I noted that Dmitry Trenin, in a speech in Moscow the other day, said that, quote, "Today and for the foreseeable future, Russia is a country at war," end quote, war for the foreseeable future. And the war aims pronounced by Mr. Putin in his different speeches are very far-reaching. In our modern European history, the war that he has launched can only be compared with what Hitler launched against Poland in September of 1939. Unprovoked, massive, and with essentially the same declared aim. Hitler wanted Poland to disappear from the map of Europe. And Putin has been explicit that he wants Ukraine to disappear from the map of our continent. For Hitler, greater geographic space was considered a necessity for the third Germanic empire that he wanted to build. Eliminating Poland was a precondition for this, as was somewhat further afield, control of the breadbasket of Ukraine. For Vladimir Putin, an independent or even autonomous Ukraine is a direct threat to the existence of Russia. He talks about it as a life and death issue for Russia. And there is little doubt that the elimination of any element of or other vestige of statehood from the vast territory of Ukraine is for him the ultimate aim of this war. We should note that he has been explicit. Some additional piece of Ukraine wouldn't be enough, since it wouldn't solve the underlying problem of Ukraine. The conflict would come back sooner or later, and in this is undoubtedly correct. Launching this war was insane. The fundamental problem for Vladimir Putin is that even if the mobilization of Russia were to gradually grind down the defense forces of Ukraine, strategic failure will be impossible to avoid. By his action, he has achieved in Ukraine that has gained internal strength and external credibility that further military onslaught can only strengthen even further. In this strategic sense, he can no longer win. He has taken Russia to the precipice of strategic disaster. 3 decades ago, our two countries sought membership of the European Union in order to make also our contribution to the building of a new order in our part of the world. An order that sought to dismantle the borders and the barriers of the past and build a Europe whole and free, democratic and dynamic. Now, in a very different situation, our two countries have decided to seek membership in the Atlantic Alliance and its military organization, in order not only to increase our own security, but also to make our contribution to stability in a period where this obviously is again under threat. I don't think this decision was made under the fear that we are facing an imminent Russian military threat. You might even argue that such a threat looks even less likely in the next few years. Both in military and economic terms, Russia in the years ahead will be substantially weaker than what we previously might have assumed. But it will be a Russia at war, also with us, as long as this present regime is in power. Weaker, but more desperate, and accordingly, in all probability, also more dangerous. It will see itself as fighting for its survival, and indeed, in the view of some of its leadership, for the very survival of Russia, and it will gear its different policies and actions accordingly. It is in this situation that it is necessary for our democracies to work as close together as we can in all of the European and Atlantic frameworks. We need a stronger military alliance in the form of NATO to deter the ultimate threat against our territories. And we need a stronger security alliance in the form of the EU to counter the many wider challenges that this situation might entail, and we need the two of them working as closely together as possible. And here I do believe that Finland and Sweden working together can make important contribution. The Russian challenge will be there. And meanwhile, other challenges have not gone away. Some decades ago, we hoped that our Europe would be surrounded by a ring of friends. Now we see the risk of us instead being surrounded by a ring of fire. South of the Mediterranean, the challenge is obvious. And there are certainly numerous in the entire region between the Nile and the Indus, and Europe isn't protected by vast oceans, at best just some narrow strips of water. In order to safeguard our security, Europe clearly needs better capabilities in a number of areas. I would argue that it's strategic capabilities, not primarily autonomy, that must be the focus of policy in the years ahead. Last week, we saw the attention of the United States focused on Asia. President Biden had key meetings in Seoul and Tokyo, and in Washington, Secretary Blinken outlined the China strategy that had been in the works for some time. We must note that in spite of the impressive leadership that the US administration has demonstrated on the Russia challenge since last autumn, it is the challenge of China and stability in the Indo-Pacific region that will be the prime focus of the United States in the years ahead. Here, Europe must obviously do its bit as well, but perhaps our most important contribution would be to take a greater responsibility for the security of our own continent, thus allowing the United States to fully play its important role at the other end of the Eurasian continent. We will remain highly dependent on the United States for key capabilities of both horizontal and vertical escalation in order to deter from aggression here in Europe. But in numerous other respects, there is much more that we can and that we should do. In our northern part of Europe, we will now have a dramatically different situation in terms of the possibilities of security cooperation. In fact, it's the first time since the demise in the early 16th century of the Union of Kalmar that virtually the entire Nordic and Baltic world will be united within the same overall security framework. There's a referendum in Denmark on Wednesday. Without interfering too much in Danish politics, I just hope it has a positive outcome as well. In our capitals here in the north, we now need to think security not only nationally, as we often do, but we need to think security in this wider framework, perhaps from historic Narva in the east to Nuuk in the west, from Kirkenes in the north, perhaps in the high north, perhaps down to Krakow, touching the very center of Europe. It was some years ago that we started to take some steps towards security cooperation between primarily the Nordic nations. Now I believe it's time to look at this with new eyes and wider perspectives. NATO membership doesn't answer all questions, but it certainly opens up new possibilities. Here, there is certainly scope for important initiatives in the years ahead. In the immediate perspective, it is Kiev and Ukraine that has to be the focus of European efforts. Our help to sustain its defense efforts. It's a question of material as well as money. Strains over this will undoubtedly raise, but we must be clear we have to stand the course. That's the immediate task, and it will be for quite some time. Then we must open our doors and minds to the absolute essential task of bringing long-term stability to Ukraine. Membership of the EU isn't a quick and easy thing, and it's certainly right to point that out. But we must recognize that the alternative to the political and economic stability that the anchor of membership of the EU, as well as the process in that direction, could give, would be a zone of instability and conflict that unavoidably will drag the rest of our continent down as well. Whether our union is up to this task in the weeks, months, and years ahead remains to be seen. But in my opinion, the road ahead should be clear. We must give Ukraine the political perspective, we must help in the immense task of physical reconstruction, and we must assist in the essential political and economic transformation that the path towards the EU always entails. Few things will be as important and as demanding on the EU agenda in the coming years. And I naturally also include a country like Moldova in that perspective, one day perhaps, although not immediately, the country of Belarus. This, in my opinion, is also the key to the future of Russia. It is only when Russia understands the futility and indeed the danger of trying to rebuild an empire and focuses on building a functioning nation state with its different minorities, that has any possibility of coming out of the profound crisis that the insane policies of the present president has thrown it into. Russia certainly has all of the resources and possibility of doing so. With well over 100 million people stretching 11 time zones, abundance of human and material resources, there's no reason whatsoever that Russia over time cannot build a stable and strong nation state. That would be also in our interest. St. Petersburg would again be a beautiful metropolis of attraction in our part of Europe. But as long as this Russia tries to rebuild an empire, it is bound to seek even further into isolation, conflict, and crisis, with all of the implications it has also for us. Twice within a century, the Russian state ultimately collapsed, where they tried to preserve a regime and an empire that was essentially unsustainable. If they are not careful, that might well be the path that Russia embarks on. Our possibilities to influence the path that Russia takes is very limited. But what we can and what we must do is to close the possibilities for its imperial temptation. And that's why our policies for and with Ukraine are so fundamentally important, not least for the future of Russia. The days since February 24 have been important in fairly obvious respects for our two countries. I think it should be said that Finland provided leadership also to Sweden on the path towards NATO. I pay my respect to the President and to all the others that made their critical contribution to this fundamentally important development. And I can only hope that what we've seen now is the emergence of a pattern that will remain. It's not a particularly well-kept secret that the foreign policy traditions of our two countries sometimes has been somewhat different. Geography and history, but also other factors, have played their part in this. Max Jakobsen once wrote that the Swedish political leadership for decades could, and I have to quote this in Swedish, they could mata sitt folk med den moraliska utrikespolitikens kaviar, medan finländarna var tvungna att nöja sig med realpolitikens havregrynsgröt. End of quote. I think it's untranslatable, but fundamental. Things might have changed slightly since Marx wrote this, but elements are certainly still there. Now we are in a new situation, in a radically torn situation for Europe, when war has returned and conflict will be us for years. We understand that we are truly together, that we will be sitting around the same tables in every respect, and that it's time to serve somewhat more of the same diet to our respective countries. A good start has been done in the weeks that have passed, but much more remains to be done in the years ahead. Thank you.
Mr. Bildt, let me thank you for a very insightful and inspirational lecture. And I'm sure that it gave us a lot of food for thought, but it also inspires for some further questions for which we now shall open the floor. Once you have the microphone, I ask you to identify yourself. And who would like to go first? Well, let me start myself. You already referred to the future Nordic cooperation in security and defense policy, and the fact that once we are all in NATO, it also makes it even easier. So it would be very interesting. Perhaps you would like to elaborate a bit.
No, this is sort of the next stage of our security cooperation. As I said, we've been, by commenting from the Swedish perspective, because Sweden has been thinking security in terms of Sweden. Surprise, surprise. And Finland has been thinking security in terms of Finland. Surprise, surprise. Now our respective security structures must, I wouldn't say give up that perspective entirely, but think in a wider perspective, in a wider both geographic and political perspective, and integrate with Norway, with Denmark, with the Baltic countries, with the other different actors. And this is sort of a transformation that is mental and political, not entirely easy, but needs to be done. But then, let's make one remark that perhaps I should make as well, that even if this is important, and NATO, and going into integrated command structures, sitting around the table with Americans and others to discuss the security challenges all of Europe, fundamental remains our national defense contributions. NATO and the Americans can, as I said, add critical components of vertical and horizontal escalation to our deterrence and stability efforts. But the essence must be done by ourselves. There is still, it was some time since I unfortunately went by ferry to Helsinki, but I always look when I go to, when you pass into Helsinki and pass Sveaborg or Suomenlinna, there are these words by Ehrensvärd that are written on the entrance to the fortress, which are also in Swedish, which is eftervärld, stå här på egen grund och lita inte på främmande hjälp. That remains important. Our own efforts are fundamental and will remain fundamental. But now we add other elements to it and add new perspectives. But the fundamentals must still be there.
Now there is someone who would pose the next question. Please.
Elina Valtonen, thank you so much, Mr. Bildt. I was wondering, because I think, and I'm pretty sure that most of us agree that what comes to Finland and Sweden, for Finland especially, the main task in NATO is to independently and first and foremost be able to defend itself and to take care, of course, as a second step of this area together with the alliance. Now, how would you see, because you touched upon the European perspective in defense, the strategic compass, which came in a time which was difficult to predict what would happen, but would the same thinking be applied to Europe in the future as well, that the first task of Europe should be to be able more independently to take care of its defense, perhaps also crisis management and everything what comes to it? And would you think that that's actually not weakening, but very much actually strengthening the transatlantic link and our relationship with the United States as well in the future? Thank you.
Well, I think, as I said, I mean, we need to do more. We need to be able to do more ourselves. We need to strengthen European capabilities. I'm slightly allergic to the debate that was there a couple of years. It's been sort of modified somewhat lately, but there was talk about autonomy. You can't do anything with autonomy. You need capabilities. And Europe needs capabilities that are better. Some of those capabilities we need to operate autonomously in certain areas, absolutely, in certain situations. But the capabilities will also be, of course, a contribution to joint Atlantic European efforts. And as I said, we should be aware of the fact that the United States will be primarily occupied by China. I was struck by, and I wasn't entirely certain I was happy with the wording in Secretary Blinken's speech the other day, but I can understand it. He said that by far, I can't quote it verbally, but he said essentially the number one challenge for international order is China. I said, well, China hasn't invaded anyone lately, to my knowledge. They haven't threatened anyone with a nuclear weapon lately, to my knowledge. So I would not perhaps have myself phrased it like that. I would have had Russia somewhat higher up on that list of priorities when it comes to destabilizing the international order. But it is the American priority. And that means that we should have that at the back of our mind all the time, that we must do more. European Union, Nordic countries, bilateral, nationally, in order also to be able to say to the Americans that essentially we do things, but we do need you in a couple of sort of critical aspects. So that's, I do think that, as a matter of fact, the entry of Sweden and Finland into NATO could be a positive factor in the sense that we go in there as countries that are sort of committed to transatlantic security, no question about that. We go in there as countries committed to the European Union. We could be able to be instrumental in bridging the capabilities of NATO and the capabilities of EU so that we get together more of a strength. Because with the spectrum of threats or challenges that we have now, NATO can answer the most serious of them, but there's quite a number of them where EU comes in, either by itself or in cooperation with NATO. So that's sort of among the things that I think that we need to spend some brain power on in the years ahead.
Thank you. I think we can still take one or two questions.
Thomas Forsberg, University of Helsinki. Thank you very much for your lecture. I would like to use this opportunity and ask something about your time as Prime Minister and Foreign Minister in Sweden. Do you remember anything like what kind of debates you had on Russia's future in the 90s and the first decade of 2000? And when did you change your view or your assessment of Russia, where it was heading? Do you remember any particular moment that you thought things are going to the wrong direction? För att undvika efterklokhet, men...
No, a good question. I belong to those that... first, I thought it was very... I invested personally quite a lot in trying to develop a relationship with Russia, or with Russians. I mean, Russia is a fairly big place. And so I went, as a young politician at the time, I went to Moscow, I went to St. Petersburg, and established fairly good links with the emerging democratic political scene in Russia, and found them impressive. And some of them are still my friends. I've spent, as a matter of fact, the last few weeks having a couple of dinners with them, but none of those dinners have been inside the borders of Russia. Then I vividly remember we invited to Stockholm we had a seminar on Russia and invited what I thought at the time and still think is, I think, the foremost historian of Russia, that is Richard Pipes. So he came over, and I vividly remember the conversation after lunch when I said, well, Professor Pipes, at the end of the day, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of Russia? And he said, I'm very optimistic about the future of Russia. And I thought, fine. Until he continued. And he said, it's only a question of 3-4 generations. And that was the sort of the difference between the practicing politician and the historian. Then I remember also, I mentioned that Corfu meeting that we had. And after we have signed our respective treaties, Sweden and Finland, the EU, and Russia, its partnership, we had a dinner between the heads of state and government, including then President Yeltsin. And he was, the dinner nearly went overboard in the sense that he nearly applied for membership of the EU. And I remember François Mitterrand went along quite a long bit for sort of allowing Russia into the European Union at that particular dinner. It was only Helmut Kohl who was someone who said, perhaps things will be somewhat different. So it was an optimistic time. Did we believe that this was going to last? Can't really remember, but I remember also coming here to Helsinki and noted that the mood here was slightly different. Can't quote anyone in particular, but the mood was really tsarerna kommer och går. They come and go, these tsars, and Russia in some sort of way remains, which I thought was slightly too passive a policy at the time. But of course there was an historical perspective and wisdom in that as well. When did it change? I remember a meeting in Moscow in the 2003. And I was there with the business circle, the RAND Corporation in the US, where I'm also on the board, still I'm on the board, and we operated as sort of a circle of Russian leaders and business leaders, and we were going to have dinner in the evening, and we had a dinner guest, and there suddenly arrived the message that Khodorkovsky had been taken off the plane in Novosibirsk by special forces and arrested. And I can still remember the mood around the table of Russian business leaders and some other leaders. I was one of them who spoke up and said, Stalin is back. There was others who just fell silent. It was going to be dangerous again. And there were a number of them in between. But the mood of that day was very heavy. Was it then it changed? I think the big change for Mr. Putin when it comes to building up this imperial, or whatever you call it, is probably when he came back for the second term. That's where I started to see the big change. Both in terms of this Eurasia Union and building something and call it imperial or whatever, and in terms of his fears of colored revolution. Remember the massive demonstrations in Moscow after elections in 2012, I think it was. And that, I think, profoundly changed his fear of what was going to be coming out of a democratic Ukraine or democratic, and it made him even determined to build some sort of thing. So from there, I think we are on a downward slide. But those are reflections from dealing with. And now, of course, we have a Russian leadership that seeks inspiration not in the future, but in the past. I can tell you my final story was from, by the way, one of those that a Russian friend I met recently who had been to Moscow very recently and talked to, shouldn't mention the name, but a very senior person, a prominent member of the National Security Council of Russia, and asked that person, who are really the people that President Putin listens to? Who are his advisors, really? And the person, member of the Security Council, said, oh, very clear, there are 3 of them. Oh, he said, who are they? Well, the first is Ivan the Terrible. The second is Peter the Great. And the third is Catherine II. He said, that's it. That's what he listens to. And I think that sort of sums it up, both in terms of the fact that that's what he seeks to achieve in some sort of way and listens to, and the fact that there aren't very many others around there, and the fact that inspiration is, as I said, not building a better future, but recreating some sort of path, but probably, as I think, a path to destruction. But that's another issue, remains to be seen. We see if Richard Pipes, I hope that Richard Pipes is still right, but we have some time to go.
Thank you very much. And now it's time for the official commentary and the remarks in response to the lecture provided by Dr. Björn Wahlroos. Please, Dr. Wahlroos, the floor is yours.
Mr. President, dear Jaakko, friend, colleague, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I take objection to the suggestion, which I think anybody who knows me understands is impossible, that I would provide the official remarks to anything. We have all been grown up with the one famous quote on Russia. Russia, a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Winston Churchill, as we all may remember. I would like to contrast that with a quote by our president, a very recent one, where he said that the masks are now off. We now see the real personage behind the mask, and a little of the riddle of Churchill has actually been, if not solved, then at least put on display. I will use this opportunity to argue a few points which have way more to do with Ivan IV, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great, Catherine II, than they have to do with Putin. So I ask for your permission, Carl, to link directly into your last answer. Because, having read, as a much younger man, Richard Pipes' classic treatise from 1974, I must admit that I am even less optimistic about Russia's future than he is, in terms of the time period that may be needed for a true transition. Finland, of course, has to live with this. Finland has always had to live with this. And we live with a country which is not only an enigma, it's a country of contradictions. And these contradictions are papered over with myths, sometimes, quite frequently, outright lies. Now, we have to live with these lies, but we no longer have to buy all these lies. We can realize that masks are off, and some of the lies have been displayed as being exactly that, lies. Because Russia is not a European country. It has never been a European country, and for all the efforts of Peter the Great, the construction of Petersburg, it has never become a European country. Having said that, I feel a strong need in front of so many senior members of the Finnish foreign policy establishment to try to explain this argument just a little more. Let me start by making a simple empirical observation. Over the last 300 years, a little depending on the definition, there are 5 or 6 constitutional transfers of power in Russia. To quote Mikhail Speransky, I think it was, regicide is our form of government and servitude our way of life. That is to a large extent still true in Russia. Now, the interesting question to me is, why is this? The distance to Moscow is not that great. Why is there such an apparent divide between the values that we subscribe to and that are inherent in the European Union and the values that seem once again to reign in Moscow? Being trained an economist, I like to look at sort of fundamental economic aspects. And what I'd like to do is point to 2 fundamental things about Russia. And when I speak about Russia, I speak about Muscovy Russia, the Moscow Russia, after the Kievan Russian had moved away. There are 2 very important aspects of the Muscovite Russia. First of all, the lack of natural borders. Russia has never had natural borders in any important direction. And secondly, Russia has always been endowed with very cheap, low productive land. That is, the amount, the yield on the land of Muscovite Russia, and this is where it's important that I'm not talking about Ukraine, has always been very low. This has made Russia different from Europe, Western Europe, we might say. And it has had a number of profound implications on what Russia is even today. First of all, it has produced a constant sense of insecurity. Russia has always been insecure. To quote Catherine II, Catherine the Great, "I have no way to defend my borders but to expand them." That is still true of Russia. It was true in Stalin's thinking in 1939, and it has always been there in Stalin's thinking in 1944 and 1945, and it has always been there. Now, this way of defending Russia by creating a defense zone so incredibly deep that it will actually stand in the place of natural defensible borders has of course also produced a false sense of greatness or superpower status. It has created a country which is so vast, Carl, like you said, 11 time zones, that it must be a superpower. Yet, the size of the Russian economy is no bigger than the Italian economy. That is one of the most fundamental contradictions about Russia, because the insecurity has always pushed it to push its borders further and further away from Moscow. Turning to the governance side of this, the lack of an opportunity to develop an independent countervailing force to the central monarchy, the lack of an economic basis on which to build an independent landed aristocracy that would stand up to the central power to create the certain balance, or at least a countervailing power, which is so crucial in the history of all Western countries, most obviously in Sweden and England. That opportunity never arose in Russia. What there was of original land ownership, land rights, property rights, and associated aristocracy was wiped out by the Mongol invasion in the 13th, 14th, and into the 15th century. And it was never re-established. Instead, Peter the Great, well, starting during Ivan IV's reign, but Peter the Great reinstituted a service aristocracy with no significant rights of independence in relation to the Tsar, after which every single Tsar recreated his own aristocracy in servitude to himself. And as a consequence, the very countervailing power, the balance of power on which the Swedish, English, and most European democracies today rest, never existed in Russia. And this brings me to my fourth conclusion. This is the very reason why autocracy, incomparably more complete autocracy than we have ever seen in Western Europe, is the rule of the day, the reality of the Russian country and state. It was reality in the late 17th century during Peter the Great. It is still reality today. Now, this takes us to a further lie with which we have learned to live and think, and that is that Russia is a military superpower. Let me be even more dramatic. I see several commanders of our armed forces, and I see other high-ranking militaries here, and therefore I know that I'm sort of walking into a trap when I'm saying that is not a correct reading of history. That is not to say that Russia would not be a nuclear superpower, which makes it so incredibly, immeasurably dangerous. But it is not and never has been a true military superpower. That is part of the Russian myth, which has become doctrine. Borodino was never a victory. It was actually a defeat. The war against Napoleon was never won by Russian brilliance. It was won by General Winter. Stalingrad was never a great Russian victory. It was won again by General Winter, combined with an outrageous stupidity on the part of the German dictator who refused his marshals to withdraw Paulus's Sixth Army. The only reason why the great patriotic war became great was that no other general than Field Marshal than Chulkov had the right to as mindlessly and immorally use manpower as he did. Out of the 30 million Russians killed in the Second World War, probably about half were killed by Russian military tactics. This is why Finland's and Swedish NATO membership is such an important thing. I will not go into that at any length, except to say one point which I think needs to be said and which I've said before. We will become members of NATO, I'm sure, and I think it's very, very important. But I also think it's actually a bit more important for NATO to have particularly Finland as a member than it is for Finland to be a member of NATO. For the very simple reason, as I've stated before, I don't think there is any Russian general as incompetent or drunk enough to argue for a military attack on Finland given the present state of our defenses. However, there is no workable NATO defense plan for the Baltic countries unless Finland provides geographic, logistical, and military support. And for that reason, we will be well received in NATO, and which is something I'm very, very happy about. Finally, I've been asked to say something about business, about the economy, and the situation that has emanated in the world. So let me try to do that. My first observation is very simple. By most standard definitions of war, we are, and I know I'm again probably walking into something that I shouldn't be walking into, we are at war. Severe economic sanctions by various international treaties are considered an act of war. And in that sense, you might say the European Union is at war. Now, I will not split hairs here. My point is somewhat different. I think it's very important for us in the European Union, in Sweden and Finland, bilaterally, to argue and think very seriously how one should conduct a war of sanctions. There are many amongst us, we saw that in this morning's newspapers very recently, who would argue that waging a war is an ethical issue. There are people who argue that all-out sanctions, a complete closure of all activities with Russia, is the only ethical way to support the Ukrainian people. Now, I'm the first to step up and say we need to support the Ukraine. However, these ethical arguments, to my mind, are militarily nonsensical and they are even dangerous. Now, why am I saying that? Because, and now I have to quote one of the greatest commanders of armor in human history, the American General George Patton, and I ask for your forbearance because you cannot quote Patton without quoting his profanities, so there will be some profanities here. Now, what George Patton said about war, I think is very instructive, even in this connection. What he said was, you don't win a war by dying for your country. You win a war by making the other son of a bitch die for his country. And the same thing is so true about economic sanctions. You do not win a war of sanctions by issuing or creating sanctions that hurt you more than they hurt the other guy. I refrain from calling Putin a son of a bitch. Now, that is very, very important when today we look at the proposed sanctions. Because when I look at the decision which is presently on the table in Brussels about the structure of the oil sanctions, I think that there are people who have begun to see the light. Because I think it makes perfect sense to allow trade in pipelined oil and to issue a sanction against shipped oil. Because there's an open international market for shipped oil, which you can access and thereby prevent excessive economic damage. And now, of course, you all see where I'm leading. It is nonsensical to issue ethical arguments in favor to extend sanction into natural gas, which actually would hurt Western Europe significantly more than it would hurt Russia. So therefore, we should not give in to arguments in war from people who are not trained in waging a war. Therefore, we have to remain sensible. We have to understand not only that we will wage this war in a sensible way, we will also have to understand that there will come a day of peace. That day of peace will not be the final solution to everything because, once more, as Richard Pipes noted, it will be at least 3 generations before Russia may become European. We have to be able to live during those 3 generations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wahlroos. And sorry for calling your remarks official. They were certainly thought-provoking, and therefore I think we might take a question or two, if you allow. Who would like to go first?
My name is Timo Harakka. Thank you for both of you, Mr. Bildt and Dr. Wahlroos, for your insights. Mr. Bildt mentioned China, so I have a very simple question. Do you see, after decades of globalization, that we are headed towards a bipolar world? And what should we do about this setup of West and the rest, or should we do anything?
It is, of course, as the Americans would say, a $64,000 question. First, I would like to just for the record make the point that, of course, this is not a world of our creation. For those who argue against a bipolar world, those who argue in favor of what they call a multipolar world, for them, of course, they need to understand that this is a situation where the apparent bipolarity has been created by someone outside, in a sense, the argument, that is Russia. The flagrant act of aggression, of course, calls for, requires a response. And as allies sign up to a joint response to the values which we hold dear and we hold dear in common, then of course an illusion or an image of bipolarity strengthens. Now, if we go beyond this obvious observation, and we go to Carl Bildt's brief comments on China, we of course realize that even today it's not a bipolar world, because the Pacific theater is, although integrated into global politics, a somewhat different issue, because it's primarily an issue between America and China, whereas we are again, in a sense, we have two other poles now acting on the European Sea. I think we would all love to see a vibrant, multipolar world. But if you have had the privilege to listen to one of the greatest analysts of multipolarity, Dr. Kissinger, and read some of his treatises on the pre-1914 world, you realize that extensive bipolarity is not without its complications. It will necessarily become a world of complex treaties, some of which will be overlapping and which will be misinterpreted, and as we saw in 1914, may sort of result in a catastrophe. So if this is a confused answer, it's because I think, at least I am somewhat confused on this issue. I think everybody is a bit confused on it. I think it's important to note that I see no obvious push on the part of any of the people that are working with these problems in leadership positions in Europe today to try to push for bipolarity as such. Quite the opposite. I think there is a strong force, a strong feeling in Europe that we should not push in that direction. We should try to strive for multipolarity, but the world, sadly, is one where, at least for the moment, this is where we are.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sinikukka Saari. I'm from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. A question to you, Dr. Wahlroos. I was somewhat perplexed by your comments on sanctions, so therefore I would like to ask, do you really see that kind of continuing business as before is really the way forward? Don't you think that cutting dependencies on Russian hydrocarbons would be a worthwhile exercise?
I'm not sure if you sort of really got my point. My point was the classical pattern point. And the classical pattern point is that you should wage war in a sensible and efficient way. War is not about cutting hydrocarbons for environmental purposes. War is about hurting your enemy more than you hurt yourself. No one has ever won a war by shooting himself in the foot. Now, what that means is not that we should stay away from sanctions, quite the opposite. You will not find another friend, bigger friend of sanctions in this hall than I am. It is extremely important that the Western world has been able to come together in extensive and intelligent sanctions. I am, however, older than you, and as a consequence, I remember Jimmy Carter's response in the late 1970s when he introduced a wheat embargo on Russia, which had absolutely no effect on nothing. He was succeeded by Ronald Reagan, who fortunately had more intelligent advisors. One of them was Richard Pipes, by the way. After which the American sanctions turned to high-tech, which had immense implications, not just on the immediate relationships, the immediate power balance, but particularly over a longer period where Russia fell further and further back from the front line of technological development. That is an intelligent way of waging a sanctions war compared to sanctioning wheat, of which there was a certain abundance in Russia at the time. The same argument applies today.
Thank you. Perhaps one more. If not, then we will thank you again, and very much useful clarification as well on the sanctions.
Thank you.
And now, we are approaching the end of our program today, so it is high time now to give the floor for the closing remarks to the protagonist of the day today. Please, Dr. Ambassador Jaakko Iloniemi.
Mr. President, Excellencies, friends, ladies and gentlemen, many friendly words have been expressed today, and I am grateful for them, although I take them with a pinch of salt. Perhaps I should take 2 pinches of salt. Many words of wisdom have been also spoken, but as a last to take the floor, I have very few assets left. One of them is something that by experience I know is a power, is to be brief. I understand that the lecture we have heard by our principal speakers, and especially first by my old good friend Carl Bildt, is meant to be a beginning of a series of lectures of this kind. And it is very thoughtful to choose Mr. Bildt as the first speaker, given the relations between our 2 countries, which are today perhaps closer than they ever were since 1809. Our former president, Dr. Juho Kusti Paasikivi, served as president of this nation in the post-war years. Dr. Paasikivi was a helmsman of our foreign and security policy for a decade. His diaries have many entries where he was mercilessly critical of his own nation. People do not understand foreign policy. They are naive and they are uninformed. His words in public were much more lenient, but this is a quote from his diary. But there is no doubt that the state of affairs that worried him greatly was because it limited his freedom of action. He needed a democratic mandate for his policies, and an uninformed public was not enough. The general public of today has better opportunities for understanding international affairs. In the 1950s, very few had ever been abroad. Very few knew any foreign languages. Many years of isolation had made a deeper understanding of world affairs almost impossible. And of course, there was no TV and no internet. Today, I would like to make a tribute to those institutions that have changed all this. I would like to emphasize that in the olden days, the Foreign Service was very restrictive about public appearances by their members. Permission was always needed if you wanted to say something in public. This is different today, fortunately, and some of our best columnists are in the service, and that is the way it should be, because much knowledge and wisdom would be otherwise lost. It was a sensible reform. Our Public Broadcasting Corporation and a number of private institutions in the same field are doing a good job nowadays as to compared with previous times. Their networks of correspondence serve us quite well. The Finnish Institute of International Affairs is a major think tank, and it extends its services far beyond the research community. One need not have a university degree in international affairs to benefit from their products. The academic research in the field of foreign policy is also quite vibrant. The Finnish Atlantic Society was a very tiny group of enthusiasts as we started activities some 20 years ago. We felt that NATO membership or not, it is important for Finns to understand the meaning and the importance of the transatlantic relationship and how NATO works. Today, the members of that association would not be able to meet in this building. I'm not only referring to this hall, but this very building, because there are already so many. In a word, much has been done, and the message is coming from these and other institutions have their proper audience. But more is needed, because year by year, the old problems will not go away, and we see constantly new problems emerging. That is one reason why I am more than just pleased. I'm really grateful for the genuine contributions that have been today made by our guest speakers in the seminar. Mr. President, your presence here and your words here lend a luster to this event, and I am deeply grateful to you for that. Your contribution, my old good friend Carl, makes sure that even in the future, those who are invited are going to be proud of having an ability to be your successors on this podium. Dr. Wahlroos, another old friend and a colleague during my brief banking career, is well known here and abroad, not only for the fact that he's an astute businessman, but he is also a genuine thinker. His thoughts are sometimes controversial, but always stimulating. With these words, friends, I would like to express my gratitude to all of you, and I resist the temptation of going into substance. You will be grateful for that. Thank you.
Minister Iloniemi, let us express our highest appreciation for your closing remarks, and we are truly privileged to learn from your experience also on this special day.
I have the feeling that I have beaten our ice hockey team.
And final thanks will follow now by Mr. Carl Haglund on behalf of the Finnish Business and Policy Forum, EVA.
Arvoisa tasavallan presidentti, bästa Kalle och bästa Nalle, Your Excellencies. I have the honor and pleasure to be the one to extend a few final words of gratitude and thank you. And I want to start out by thanking all of you who enabled this first annual lecture. Of course, foremost, I want to congratulate you warmly, Jaakko, on your anniversary. It's been an honor and pleasure to be part of enabling this wonderful and interesting lecture today in times that are very, very extraordinary, and extraordinary times also demand interesting events to analyze them, and I think we certainly succeeded with that today. So in order to enable such an event like this today, you need to have a very good arranging party, and I want to, on behalf of Eva and also Atlantti-Seura, thank the Foreign Ministry for great cooperation around the event. Without that, it wouldn't have been possible to arrange this. So thank you, and a special thank you to Terhi, Sini, and Emilia, who's spent so much time around this event making all of this possible. So with these brief words of thank you, we are going to wrap up this event and shortly move to the reception. So once more, warm congratulations, and thank you very much.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this Jaakko Iloniemi lecture event is now closed, and I kindly ask you to proceed towards the opposite hall for the reception hosted by Minister for Foreign Affairs, Mr. Pekka Haavisto.